Oh, good. Okay, we're ready to go. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us today. My name, I saw many of you last night, but if you weren't here, my name is Vivian Schiller. I am the executive director of Aspen Digital. We are a program, I've heard from some of you who have been around the Aspen Institute for a while that you've never heard of Aspen Digital, and that's because we've only been around for about a year and a half. I joined the Aspen Institute only about 6 weeks before the pandemic starts, but we are a program that is partly a roll-up of some programs that you probably are familiar with, including the Communication and Society program, as well as our great cybersecurity work. You probably, hopefully you saw that amazing session just now with Garrett Graff, who's part of the Aspen Digital team, and Chris Krebs, who's a fellow with Aspen Digital. And we look at all things at the intersection of media, the internet, and technology. So thank you for joining this session. Also, if you were here last night for our session on misinformation, where we were going through all the different facets of what contributes to the current crisis, you will have heard me say that one of the big issues is around the collapse of local journalism, but I said we're not going to talk about it right now last night because we're here to talk about it today. So you've probably heard the statistics, or at least know a little bit about the fact that over the last 10 years and then accelerated during the pandemic, thousands of news organizations have shut down. Many tens of thousands of journalists are out of work. Hedge funds are buying up the biggest newspaper chains and turning them into what we're calling ghost papers, which are basically a shell of their former selves. Many mid-sized cities really have no dedicated news organizations at all, no independent news organizations that are actually covering what's happening on the ground, as opposed to, there's plenty of news about at the national level. Let's just be really clear. That's not particularly a crisis right now. But the repercussions and the implications for the collapse of local news is not just the poor journalists who lost their job. I'm not saying that's not a problem, but a lot of people have lost their job. It's not about the journalists. It's about journalism as a conduit to the citizenry, and that to make sure that all of us have the information we need to participate in our societies. And in that sense, it truly is a crisis, because when you have a void of local news with the collapse of so many of these news organizations, into that void is flowing a lot of bad things, including propaganda, falsehoods, hyper-partisan, I don't want to call it news, I'll just call it content that is not necessarily rooted in fact. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, which is how do we save local journalism? How do we restore it? How do we make sure as communities we have the information we need, because it is absolutely critical to democracy. Fortunately, we have two spectacular guests here today who, let me introduce you to them. So Mitra is a longtime journalist. She has held executive level positions at courts, at the LA Times, was there someplace before CNN? Did I miss one? Oh, Wall Street. Oh, LA Times. And sorry, I've known her for so long, I'm like, I know I skipped one. And she was most recently the head of coverage for CNN Digital, which is, of course, is one of the most powerful news engines on earth. Mitra would easily have been the CEO, I am sure, or the editor-in-chief or the executive editor of a major national or global news organization, but instead she decided to step down from that path and take a different route because, well, I'll let her tell her own story, because she saw a crisis, particularly around underrepresented communities, and she decided she was going to do something about it. So that's my little tease. We'll hear more about that. Stuart VanderWaal is someone that I first met a little over 10 years ago. I was the CEO of NPR, and Stuart at the time was the head of KUT, which is the public radio station in Austin. And when I met Stuart, I immediately, and I had traveled all over the country, met a lot of local public radio heads, and Stuart was hands down, head and shoulders, whatever cliche you want, one of the most forward-thinking leaders in public media, and understood where media was going at a time when a lot of people were really holding on to the past. And now Stuart is the head of Colorado, sorry, I'm still learning to get rid of my Eastern pronunciation of the state, Colorado public media based in Denver, and is just doing extraordinary, extraordinary work, which we'll hear about more. So with that, we're going to do, so the plan is we're going to spend the first part of time talking about unpacking what the problem is. You know, why are we seeing this decline? What are the impact on it? But then, hang on, because we're going to talk about what we do about it, and we're going to talk about solutions, and we're going to hear from all of you. So I also just want to mention, in addition to seeing all the faces in the room, we are also being live streamed, and so we welcome our streaming audience as well. Okay, so enough from me. Let's talk to the two of you. I want to start with just a really open-ended question, and I'll begin with you, Mitra. What is the problem we're trying to solve?
Oh, gosh. Everything.
Yeah.
The problem we're trying to solve, I mean, I feel like we could just take the last year alone, and this will start to give you hints of why I left CNN and launched a tiny, tiny newsletter. I mean, it's kind of a, you know, like talk about your parents suddenly being like, what is happening with you, you know? And they're Indian immigrant parents, so really that is a huge, huge thing for them to be like, you're leaving a perch as the senior vice president at CNN to launch a newsletter with a few hundred subscribers. So what happened, and I will say what the problem to solve is, over the last year has really just come to a head. We have been facing, present tense, a life and death pandemic. We have not just misinformation that has filled the gaps, as Vivian so eloquently kind of laid out for us, but we have great mistrust of our institutions. And so at a CNN, as much as there is urgency for me to get the news out, I oversaw the breaking news team, I ran the team that buzzes in your pocket with the alerts, so I'm sorry about that, because there were a lot of them over the last 5 years that I was there. The second piece of that is almost more important, and yet because of the news cycle we've been through, we deprioritized what is our relationship, not just with our users or customers, but our audiences and our communities. Really, community is the word that I use over and over and over to describe what Epicenter, my organization, is trying to do now. I think the other issue that for me came to a head was the protests after the death of George Floyd, which you know, I've been involved in, as Vivian also alluded, in advocating for underrepresented communities to be not just a part of our newsroom, but a part of our news agenda every morning. And I could have stayed on that trajectory because, as you all know, the desire for mainstream institutions to represent, at least in my 20+ years in journalism, has never been greater than this moment. And yet, there was another part of me that was like, I don't want to be the person pushing newsrooms to do the right thing anymore. I have been through 5 mergers and acquisitions in my mainstream media career. If you want a company to be bought, you should just hire me, because I've been through Rupert Murdoch, Mark Willis, the Tribune Tronc days, and then AT&T buying Time Warner. And so I'll be honest, I trusted myself, and I said, I feel like ownership is actually one of the elephants in the room when it comes to doing the right thing. And it's not just for journalism. I would think that we're at a moment where we could say that for business writ large. And so Epicenter was launched. I think the other problem we're facing, Vivian, is that being tiny on the internet really sucks, because you are up against Google, Facebook, you know, Amazon. We could talk about algorithms and just like the maddening rush in newsrooms to understand them every day. That's one challenge, but the other challenge is just being small. You have no chance against somebody searching, whether it's misinformation or just accurate information. A newsletter of a few, now we have a few thousand people, thank you very much, we've exploded, but just still doesn't have a chance against Google. And so what we created is a network This is called URL Media, and URL stands for Uplift, Respect, and Love. Because I felt like I can be small and be trusted. I can be small and be authentic. I can be small and be successful within my community. But if I'm not going to succeed on the internet, every lesson I've learned at, whether it was CNN or the LA Times, you could just throw it out the window, and I might as well not exist. And so my hope that I've kind of staked my future on is a network model where we all get to be ourselves, but band together and get communities to trust our institutions, but also serve each other and not just see journalism as kind of this passive player in the process. And the last thing I'll just say is that the stakes are so high, right? And for my community, I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, one of the hardest hit places in the pandemic. When I say this was life or death, to not have accurate information, to not have government services, to not understand, these are our communities at stake, and so it's not just kind of an academic question for me. This is really about our families and our neighbors.
Before I turn it over to Stuart, I just want to say, what you will notice there are some themes that will emerge through this conversation. I only know this because I'm having this conversation a lot. And two things I just want to point out, and I know that's going to you're going to talk about that as well. Local ownership, local people on the ground, not other people sort of flying in, and trust and connection to the community. And Stuart, your work, you are not a startup. You are public radio. Public radio network in this country has been around for a long time, but is in a way, many ways, having a movement because it's always been rooted in the community. So talk about what you've seen, particularly in the last year, and how you see this evolving.
And I'll definitely get to that point. I'd like to say that the problem is not evenly distributed. It's much different from community to community. This is a remarkable community between the North Fork and the Roaring Fork. There's 4 independent public radio stations. There's 2 independent newspapers. This is a remarkable place. The newest leader in public radio in Colorado is Breeze Richardson with Aspen Public Radio. So looking forward to working with Breeze going forward. The bottom line, to your point, is sort of a business model that is built upon a local news organization being encumbered with delivering a net margin to an absentee owner for whom community service is not the prime objective, is a business model that ultimately will turn its face to the owner versus to the community that it serves. And that's the fundamental problem with the decline in beloved institutions from city to city across this nation. Public media has a different business model. We're built in the communities in which we operate. We're licensed to those communities. We answer to boards who live within those communities. We can't be sold. We can't be moved. And the net margin that we definitely seek to achieve is invested back in what we do. And so I think there's elements of that model that are starting to seep into what you would call traditional media. And I think that's very much the pathway forward.
Yeah, and we're going to get back to solutions, but I wanted to press everybody for a little while longer before we get there. So in just talking about let's talk for a minute about what is the problem? Why has local journalism collapsed? What has changed in the business model that has made what was once a pretty sustainable, even lucrative business, something that just can't be sustained at all? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the first thing is the collapse of classified advertising. Who knew that the newspaper business was built so much on putting that ad for your yard sale in the back of the paper? and Craigslist completely did away with that, and now Nextdoor and other things. So that, that was the start of the collapse. And then companies with overwhelming debt couldn't service the debt, consolidations and mergers, and it's a spiral. And then, ultimately, you have to sustain your organization from and for the community in which you operate.
Yeah, but also, in addition to classified advertising, a lot of other advertising went away.
So I was going to say that there's also macro forces. So for example, in a community like mine, maybe you used to get the small retailers, but we've also seen massive consolidation among retailers themselves. And so journalists often sort of, unfortunately, don't look at these macroeconomic forces, and yet, you just look at Macy's and say, well, where's Macy's advertising, and what has that done to the collapse of local journalism, right? And so I do think this is a really important factor that we sort of gloss over, our dependence on more diversity of retail advertising. Newspapers also, I think we fail to see people buying them as much for the advertising. And so in some of the recent strategy and pivots, there have been many pivots in our newsrooms over the last 20 years, we really counted on this idea that if I do a good story, people will come and people will pay for it. And I think I'm going to say something damning about journalists, and I consider myself a journalist. Some of my best friends are journalists. I love journalists. But from a business perspective, I think we didn't understand the value of our product and why people were turning to newspapers. And what we tried to do initially was create kind of a facsimile version of the newspaper on the internet in a completely different business model. And I don't think you can separate the FANGs, which I alluded to earlier.
FANGs being Facebook.
Facebook, yeah. Amazon, Apple,
Google,
and did I get them all?
Yeah. Netflix.
Oh, sorry. Oh, gosh, yeah. I don't think you could separate just these behemoths and the inability to compete at scale.
Right.
Just one last thing I'll say, Vivian, is that I also think over the last few years, media on the internet sort of favored what I call tonnage, like how many people are coming to your site as a sign of being successful, versus how many people actually value you, right? Is this information literally creating something of value? And whether people pay for it, we'll get to solutions in a moment, but I don't know that we ask like some real basic questions around that.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think a lot of journalists are wonderful journalists, but not very good business leaders, and maybe missed a lot of opportunity. You talk about, Craigslist pulling classified advertising away from newspapers. On the other hand, the news industry could have created, an online classified site, but didn't do it. And so, they got innovated. That business got innovated out from under them, and we can look at that again and again. And the rise of the platforms, and the fact that, frankly, the platforms, the reason advertising is going to the platforms is because they are delivering an extraordinarily efficient, useful product, and being able to target people who are the most likely to be interested in an ad. So if you're an advertiser, you know exactly where your money's going towards. So it's complicated. The world is changing. I want to just talk, before we move on to solutions, I just want to talk about the risks. You are filling a void. In your markets, Stuart, you are going to begin to fill a void market by market all over the country, particularly in underrepresented communities. Where there is this vacuum, what are you seeing, and what is the risk? That's a very leading question.
I mean, one thing I would say is when I mention underrepresented communities, you can't separate misinformation and, like, you could just look at my family. Anyone who wants to look at my family WhatsApp group after this, you're welcome to see the vacuum of information. And many of our communities are global, so we often operate as though local news is kind of this bordered, parochial, like, 6-mile radius of coverage. And for the communities that we're targeting, that's absolutely not true. There are incredibly nefarious forces that are pervading, again, my family's phones and our lists that we're on pretty much at every moment. There's another danger that I'll talk about that I think national media is just as guilty of, and I take responsibility as well for the role that I've played in it for having mostly a career in national media, which is there's an on-the-ground reality. There's what government agencies tell you is happening. And those two things do not meet in our coverage. And I'll just use as an example, Epicenter really played a very significant role in booking New Yorkers for their vaccines, although we define New Yorkers very liberally because taxi drivers would say, could you help my cousin in Kansas? And we'd say, yes, we can help your cousin in Kansas, to the point of community being very expansive in how we view it. And in the process of that, undocumented immigrants were saying, they're asking for our ID. They're turning us away. And if you would call the government agency, they'd say, Andrew Cuomo himself said, you can't be denied a vaccine if you're undocumented. And we would say, okay, but these are 12 people who just called us today. They've been, and so what happens? The way that national news reporting works is you call the agency, you take their word for it, and that's what's reported as fact, right? And so you can understand why the people who are on the receiving end of both injustice, but also that information, start not to believe what's being said. And so what I feel like we have this unique vantage point of, and what I really welcome in the pandemic, is scrutiny at the ground level to hold government accountable. And we are so much better as journalists. We're so much more effective at holding government accountable if we're actually doing it from the people who government is supposed to be serving, right? Those are our communities. I worry that the national news report, first of all, it tends to be 6 weeks late. The guy was evicted 6 weeks ago. He knows it's a problem. We catch up to it later. By then, we can't even help him keep his home. And so there's already a delay, but also there isn't necessarily a rootedness and a care for the community to actually get out of the predicament.
As local news declines, agencies step in and become their own news bureau.
That's right.
And the Colorado Trust did a survey on this. Colorado Trust is a health-based trust focused on, and they did a survey focused on where are people getting their information, and they find that people are getting their information directly from agencies, which sometimes there's a gap between what the agency is saying and what's actually accessible to people on the ground. And so it's important for news organizations to check that and to be a check and balance on that. The other element of the problem is just the rampant misinformation. And we saw it obviously during the pandemic, but also during the election. And in order to sort of debunk the misinformation takes a lot of time and resources. You have to have enough reporters and editors. You have to have sometimes money to do open records requests in order to get the information that is the counter to the misinformation. I'll give you one example. There is all kinds of stories about the integrity of voting in Colorado, which has one of the best, as it turns out, mail-in voting ballot system. But because there was so much misinformation, we spent time investigating our own voting system, and specifically, what are the instances under which people's vote gets denied because it's invalid, usually because of their signature. And as it turns out, 100,000 people had their vote canceled, invalidated, over the course of about 5 years, so not very many in the aggregate. But it turns out that predominantly it was young people and people of color who had their vote invalidated. Well, wouldn't know that if we hadn't done the research behind the overall integrity of our voting system, and having the resources to do that is essential.
This kind of, having that kind of accountability that can really only be done by having strong independent local news organizations on the ground. It's not just the work that you're doing, but also just the very fact that politicians or business leaders know that somebody is watching. And this is absolutely essential. The only other thing I want to say before we move towards solutions is, in this vacuum is, as we mentioned earlier, we know, first of all, it's important to know that survey after survey show, just like people say, I don't trust Congress, but I trust my congressman, you see the same thing in media. I don't trust the media. Oh, but of course I trust my local paper, or my local public radio station, or my local online newsletter. And it's so important that we have those trusted institutions. And there are bad actors who are creating online news organizations that have fancy names that seem right, which are not independent and are not neutral and are not doing proper reporting. And this is filling that void, as are Facebook groups and chats on Nextdoor and what have you. So this is really, really important. Let's move towards solutions. So the exciting thing about local news is there is so much innovation happening. Mitra, what you are doing is just one of many, many really interesting experiments, a lot of which have taken root all over the country. Again, we see, public radio's been around for a long time, but is really beginning to innovate with leaders like Stuart. And we're seeing new not-for-profit entities rising up. Some of the the old ones like Texas Tribune are doing very well, but many, many new ones all over the country. So talk a little bit about what is exciting to you. Where do you see the greatest possibility for a resurrection and growth and sustainability for local journalism? Go.
Should I start? So we're putting our future on three tracks, if you will. One is philanthropy. So I launched Epicenter when I was still at CNN, and I got a call in the summer from the Ford Foundation saying, we love what you're doing. This is precisely the type of pandemic work we'd like to support. And they gave me a grant. There was a business planning grant. It basically made it possible for me to innovate this as a business as opposed to just a reaction to our current circumstances. And I think that's significant for a lot of news outlets because we were able to, we formed out of serving a specific community. It's not like some group of funders dreamed us up and said, wouldn't it be great to serve this community in the following ways, right? We really did come out of community need, and I said, my husband and I are gonna go broke if we keep responding to everyone. Why don't we do an email newsletter to just make this a little more amplified? And we'll throw some art in there and some, can you get yeast at this store? And y'all remember what it was like last spring. So when the Ford Foundation called me, it signaled to me that the role that philanthropy has is twofold. One is just the resources were revolutionary. We're able to start paying artists, which was, again, at that moment in New York City, really changed our positioning as being for the community and not just kind of the black and brown charity face. It was really important to me that we're not just a charity case, but that we're also literally uplifting New Yorkers. So that was, the Ford Foundation was enormous redemption of the idea, the resources, and it sort of signaled to me that philanthropy, especially as some of these ventures are getting off the ground, plays a vital role. The second is advertising. So Epicenter has just landed its first advertiser. McKinsey sponsored us for the summer. Thank you, yeah. And that's because that allows us to hire a community manager, right? And now we have a podcast, we have live streams, we're no longer just this little newsletter. So you can we're not even 1 year old yet, and you see this infusion is able to help us grow. The third is subscriptions. We just launched a membership program, and Vivian, as you mentioned, the Texas Tribune is kind of the textbook on this of membership. I would say one thing that we've really been clear on is that it's not just our content, but also what I say is convening is greater than content. Being the glue that helps the community find each other is what you're paying for. And then I'm in Aspen, so I might as well tell you all this. It doesn't always come up. We also run a newsletter called The Escape Home. It's very bougie, I must say. $99 a year. And we beta launched it 2 weeks before Airbnb's IPO. As you all know, the second home market has exploded. Y'all can just look out. We just look out and see the houses over here to see what I'm talking about. And I think that diversifying who we're serving is a really important part of this. And whenever I say that, people always think I mean, oh, well, there she goes again, talking about black and brown people in the newsroom. And I'm like, no, I'm talking about second homeowners and niche communities that are willing to pay premium prices for content that, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, maybe they'll cover occasionally, but we also have so many niche communities, and I would argue the pandemic, kind of more people have self-identified in this way. I see that as a solution, and also kind of pivoting our membership to serve micro communities. And then the last thing I'll just say is the URL network relies on outlets like the Haitian Times, Documented, Epicenter, WURD, a Philadelphia radio station, working together so that
Partnership.
It's just partnership. I mean, how can a small news outlet do all the things I just said? You can't do all the things.
It's really hard to innovate a legacy media while maintaining the legacy media, and public radio been around. I mean, the station in Colorado Springs, which is now part of Colorado Public Radio, was the first public radio station in Colorado. It's been around 70 years. And so this is definitely legacy media. And I've always worried that, 5 people in a coffee shop who weren't also managing the huge enterprise that is public radio would eventually eat our lunch. And so we bought that. Denverite was 5, 6 people focused solely on delivering a digital news product that speaks to people who live, work, and play in Denver. And when we acquired Denverite, we didn't just collapse it into CPR. We said, we want you to do what you're doing, and we're going to put the infrastructure around you so that the managing editor for Denverite wasn't also updating people's credit card numbers because it was such a small operation. We said, Denverite, you can do journalism, only do journalism, and we'll provide all of that revenue infrastructure behind it. And we kind of see that as the future, that taking what we know how to do really well and applying it to new platforms and services. The other thing that I would add, and I like what you're doing with URL, is I think there's an opportunity for what I'd call radical cooperation. That collaboration is something that's basically, I feel, is generally done out of convenience and attention. Like when you got the right timing and the right interests come together, hey, let's collaborate on this. But cooperation is an agreement. And I think there's an opportunity with stations around the state, around the country, that with limited resources, take those resources and just hyper-focus them on what that community needs, and through cooperation, build out your service with content from other cooperative partners. And you're doing something in that area that I see as something we may apply to our operations.
I love it.
Public
There's
radio.
some radical collaboration going on right here. We want to go. We want to now take your questions, and we will take questions from the room. And I think I'm going to get some questions from online that will show up on the screen in front of me. So, but if there's anybody, I want to go first to the room. If anybody wants to raise their hand. Okay, to warm you up, we'll start with the screen. And there's a question from Anonymous. How do we create a loyal following of readers? Oh, that's a good one. Want to talk about loyalty? Stuart, why don't you take that one first?
Yeah, so, I think it's authenticity and personality. People don't want the news that they consume to come from some source that they don't connect with. And so I think that's what builds loyalty with public radio, is you feel you have a relationship with those who are delivering that content experience to you. And so I think that's the first part of that.
say it's, there's two parts. One is the art, and then the other is the science. I'll talk about the latter first. Just the data that, being at a CNN, which is so huge, it was, it's the biggest news organization on the planet. Our homepage is so powerful. So I got comfortable with data, and the benefit of TV is that ratings have always been a part of the culture of that newsroom. And I've actually tried to bring that into our operation just to say, what are people clicking on in our newsletter? And it was food delivery, right? In those early days, it was food delivery. And so that starts to say, look, our community is telling us that, they want more on this area. Day trips. And so that started to, day trips was another area that people were like, where can I get outside? And again, this might sound super obvious, but being able to guide and listen to your readers and then continue to meet them is such an important part of the loyalty, and then having features that are somewhat regular so they can count on. I think people do want to know, again, this just gets to the trust of institutions, what can I count on you for?
If there's no, okay, great, there's a question in the room right here. Oh, hold on, there's a mic coming for you.
I'm curious about the role of your newsletter and the lack of papers covering things like school board meetings and other things. As papers disappear, what goes on becomes less and less possibly palatable.
Yeah. So we actually, it's a great question, and you're giving me a chance to promote another one of our newsletters. It's called The Unmuted. So we launched a schools newsletter because it was literally 2 weeks before school was supposed to start in New York City, and no New York City school parent knew whether school was going to start or not. And so we, similar to kind of in Epicenter, we said, do you all want a school, just a pop-up schools newsletter just to figure out what the heck is going on? We asked our audience. It was the most response we ever got to any question, and everyone said, yes, please. So we launched The Unmuted, the name of which I love, because that was like basically what I heard all year with my two kids and their schooling. So school board meetings is interesting. I used to cover education for the Washington Post. What we positioned our newsletter as was not covering school board meetings. We said this is going to be a tool for parents to feel empowered. And that's like our framework. It's not for teachers, although teachers certainly subscribe. It's not only for students. And I think that focus for us helped us just figure out, and it's the largest school system in the country in New York City, how are we going to cover this and what's our piece of it, to the point earlier about micro communities. I think a lot of news organizations have covered school board meetings as though they're covering the building versus covering the phenomenon and issues that students, teachers, parents have together, the government's involved, health is certainly, like it just is such a widespread beat that I worry when we cover the meeting, we're kind of doing a version of this is what happened in the meeting. And to Vivian's point about accountability, the puzzle, I do not pretend to have solved this, for me, is to present a level of accountability but still be relevant to users that really don't care about the school board meeting. They just want to know what affects them out of it. And so I have to figure out, and this, again, this is an active process, not covering the building, but covering the human impact of it.
Yeah, the human impact versus the procedure.
That's right.
And that's what, I think that's what we're generally good at in public media, is telling you the human-centered story of how this may affect you and affect the community. And that kind of goes back to my idea around, radical cooperation, and that is in each community in which there is a news organization, to have that news organization make sure it fundamentally focuses on what that agency issue is within that community. And it might be the school board, it might be the water board, it might be agriculture, but what is most important to the life and livelihood within that community, and then through cooperation fill out their news experience with other content as well. Because if all they do is the school board, then it's not a complete experience. And many news organizations are so small, they try to do too much and ultimately aren't able to do enough on the thing that matters the most.
we had some other questions in the room. So right here in the, and then we'll take one from our streaming audience.
I saw a study the other day, I wish I remember the origin, 2 days ago, ranking countries by how much trust their populations put in their media.
Yeah.
And but you're nodding your heads, you know where I'm going with this. The US ranked last, and it was an ugly last.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I just want to say that study you talked about was from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, which puts out an excellent report. And indeed, yes, the US was last in trust.
We all saw the study and had the same reaction. I mean, I would say that having lived overseas, the country I'm most familiar with is India, but I was raised for part of my youth in Latin America. Media is very personal in those countries, and I think that what we're trying to do in some ways is bring back feeling like your news outlet is as influential as your uncle on Facebook, and that is hard. And I think that the gulf in national news from our, I mean, sort of getting back to what we started the conversation out with. The other thing, which won't be welcome news to the other countries that rank higher than us, is they will go through a version of the correction we've gone through thanks to the shrinking of print media. Like in countries like India, print media is still very much a part of people's habits. I suspect they'll go through, and again, other developing countries I suspect will go through what we're going through in print phasing out. So that's not to excuse how poorly the US fares. Stuart, is there anything else you'd add to that, or Vivian?
I mean, I think it follows the partisan divide very, very significantly, and that media sources get labeled, and if you're a fan of one, you're probably not a fan of the other, and so then people kind of stay in their echo chamber, and that's not a healthy place to be. Less so at the local level. Trust in local news is much higher than trust in national news. And then that's also been used against us with fake local news sites created in order to disseminate misinformation under the banner of something that looks like a local news site. And so that's something else that we have to fight against.
We are going to end with just one last question. I promised I'd give equal time to the room and the streaming community. And that is, the question is, what innovative strategies are being developed to help consumers of online news to sample from diverse sources and broaden the perspectives they consume? This is a good note to end on, because we're talking about introducing new ideas as a solution to some of the partisanship and some of the polarization that we've seen. So go ahead, Mitra, and then let's just try to keep it reasonably short.
Okay, I could be brief. So URL Media in many ways is precisely for this. We felt like we have 8 partners right now. I've mentioned some of them, including Epicenter, the Haitian Times, a Bangladeshi live streaming channel. And I just felt like in my own consumption of community news, I was finding these outlets were early, they were distinct on coverage, they were representative. And so diversifying also the sources that you are all getting your own information from, I think, is step one. Our service is a newsletter. We hope to shift to daily. We're growing right now. But we basically summarize and aggregate news from around the country, eventually the world, from partners like this. And we pride ourselves on being pretty early in the news agenda, because by the time the grassroots bubbles up to national media, it's anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. The other areas which, I have a very mixed feelings about Substack and some of these kind of niche voices on the internet for a variety of reasons, but I do find myself increasingly seeking just different voices out in my own social media feeds, and that starts to inform just my own consumption and my own framing of how CNN or NBC might be covering the news, for example.
I would just add that large-scale distributors, and I'd put us in a pretty large-scale distributor of content. I think we have to be really generous about sharing other organizations' content with a filter, and the filter is, this is a trusted source, and that we use our trust to help elevate the trust of other sources that may have a smaller audience. It could be focused on education, it could be focused on a topic area, but we should be a significant distributor of content like that.
Great. Stuart, Mitra, thank you so much. You give me so much hope.
Thank you,
And
Vivian.
thank you, everybody, for your attention.
Thank you.